Welcome to the Cubiks Talent Talk, how to find your rough diamonds, identifying high potential. My name's Adam Vassar. I'm the U.S. Country Manager for Cubiks. Very happy to have you all with us today. We have hundreds of individuals joining us from all over the world for our Talent Talk. Very excited to have you all with us. Thanks for making some time, and it's going to be a good conversation. Just to give you some overview of how we'll be spending the next 30 minutes, we're going to be covering the concept of potential. So what are the challenges that organizations typically run into when attempting to find their high potentials? What are some of the best practices that you can engage in order to identify high potentials? And what are some of the insights that we've discovered as Cubiks with our experience and our scientific research? You're going to hear from us, but we also want to hear from you. So we're going to have a few different activities to get your insights, make sure we're covering this topic from the perspectives that make sense to our viewers. Number one, in a few minutes, we'll have a poll. We'll ask you a very specific question regarding the topic of potential, and we'll be getting your input, talking about the results of that poll. Also, I would encourage you not to wait until the end of our conversation to submit your questions. You have a questions tab in your GoToWebinar. Please submit the questions as you think of them. Don't hesitate. Let us know what's on your mind, what you want to talk about, the insights you want to hear from us. And at the end of our conversation, we will address those questions and give you the feedback you're looking for. So this is the first of many talent talks we'll be hosting, and look forward to have you joining us in the future. Most importantly, I want to introduce our guest, Anja Sbanski. Anja is the German country manager for Cubiks, and most critical to this conversation, she's our lead architect for the potential solution. Anja has been working with organizations since 2011, supporting their implementation of high potential programs. Anja, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward.
Yeah.
Nice.
Anja's an expert on the topic. I'm going to be providing my insights. You'll be hearing a lot from us, but we want to start with getting some of that input from you. So very shortly, you'll be seeing a poll appear on your screen, and we're asking you a very, very specific question. What is your biggest concern when it comes to high potential programs? And you'll see you have a few different options. Hopefully we've covered most of the areas. One is demonstrating the value that you're meeting business objectives in this high potential program is delivering value for the organization. These are time-consuming projects. These are very important projects. There's an investment. Are you delivering value for your company? Two, are you identifying the right people? Are you getting the right individuals with high potential into the potential program? And three, is your concern more about the administrative time and administrative challenges and effort that goes into administering a program like this? So hopefully we're covering most of your needs with those three options. Go ahead and click your option, click what you're most concerned about. And in a few minutes, we'll come back to that poll, let you know what the results were, and we'll discuss that a little bit. And we did a similar poll in the US a few weeks ago during our webinar, and about half of the attendees had said that getting the right people into the program was really their primary concern, which certainly resonates with the conversations that I've had with organizations. So Anja, you're typically in Germany, but also working internationally on these projects. What do you hear out there in terms of concerns?
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to that. So the question, do we really have the right people in our high potential pools? Do we have enough high potentials? And do we invest in the right people is really a crucial one. And it all starts with that common language in an organization. So do we have that common understanding of what potential really is?
Yeah, I think the common language is critical. If you ask 30 people in a company, what is high potential? How do you define potential? You're going to get 30 different answers. And there is no one perfect answer, but I think there are some important concepts that should be included in that definition. So Anja, from your perspective, what are those concepts? How do we define potential?
Yeah, what we hear a lot is the word talent to be used for high potential, but talent is more about a talent for a specific, very defined role, whereas potential is more looking into the future. So the ability or capacity to grow into a more complex role in the future without knowing how this is really defined. And this is especially now as we are living in an ever-changing world of work. It's now very important to look at that potential, like a more general potential to grow. Yeah.
So we're asking our managers to see the future, to predict the future, and it can be done, but it can be challenging as well. I'm finding in organizations often that managers have very little choice other than to depend on performance. So looking at that current performance to predict the future potential of the employee.
Yeah.
How does this work from your perspective?
Well, it's a pitfall more or less, because it doesn't mean that your current high performance will be your high potentials of the future. And on the other hand, it doesn't mean that somebody who's not performing in the current role will not have potential to take on a more complex or completely different role in the future. So you need to be careful when just looking at performance. I'd rather say that potential is the future performance.
Potential is the future performance. I like it. Yeah. I think performance is part of the equation.
Yeah.
But it's so difficult to use that as your primary driver of making those decisions, because as you said, potential really is the future performance. Well, very good. Well, we'll keep expanding on that and discussing the topic with our insights. But again, want to go back to our audience and see what the results of the poll look like. So I have it here on my phone from our trusty team working behind the scenes, and we see that it's very, very dramatic here. 68% of those who tuned in, actually more than we've seen in other polls, said that their primary concern was getting the right people into the program. So that's consistent with what we've seen in other parts of the world, actually stronger. So almost 70% of our attendees are concerned with picking the right people to be high potentials.
Yeah.
They're concerned about this. Why do you think they're concerned? Why do you think it can be challenging?
Yeah, partially it is the issue with just measuring performance. So in most organizations that we work with, the only decision to be nominated for a high potential pool is with a manager. And those managers, of course, are very good in rating the current performance and seeing the current performance. But this also leads to missing out on the rough diamonds. So somebody who is not a high performer right now might not be looked at in terms of high potential. And it's also, we're all human, right? So we have that errors, that biases when observing people. Like, for example, the similar to me effect. I'm selecting somebody who has been to the same university, looks like me, whatever. So that's just good. One of them. Yeah, it feels good.
Yeah, it's these unconscious biases that we don't intend to, insert into our decision making, but it's, as humans, the way we make sense of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So the hard thing is really to make it more objective.
Right, because right now it's very subjective. It's quite interesting. I think we see some similar things around the world, which I think is good news. The more common the symptoms are, I think the more readily available some of the solutions. That's interesting. Okay, well, I think we know where we need to focus, and as we think about this topic, certainly we felt it was important enough to put on this talent talk on potential. The hundreds of individuals tuning in to join us from around the world thought it was an important enough topic to take some time out of their day. Why do you think this is so important to organizations to identify high potentials and get it right?
Well, there's research on the market that says up to 80% of your business success depends highly on the top 10% performing people. So spotting those high potentials at a very early stage and develop them in the right way is crucial to your business success, right? And also it's when you're not doing that, you will not be able to find those performers of the future to fill in your key roles. And the people you might not identify, like wrongly not identify, the rough diamonds, that might also leave your company. So it's a big loss for the company if you don't do it.
Yeah, I think some of the diamonds out there, they thump their chest, they tell you they're high potential, and they may be.
Yeah.
But as you're saying, it's harder to find those individuals who are just doing their job every day. They could also be your high potentials, but you need to cast that net very broadly to find them, to engage them, and as you said, not lose them.
Yeah.
What are, in terms of when we're attempting to do this, it's, again, we don't want to position it as an extremely difficult objective, but companies do struggle. There was a Harvard Business Review article recently that said about 40% of the individuals identified for high potential programs, generally across organizations, shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
So we're kind of back to a coin flip scenario.
And it's a big investment for companies.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when we get it wrong.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, we're defining potential, but it's an all or nothing kind of thing. From your perspective, is it a matter of you have potential or you don't? And if you have potential, that's the end? Or is it can we expand more on that concept of potential?
I'd rather look at different forms of potential. So when we talk about general potential, it's really finding those rough diamonds. It's typically at the earlier stage of your career, where you just have potential to grow into more complex roles, covering all the necessary attributes. And then as we go along in the employee life cycle, we look at more of a specific potential, like, for example, leadership potential or being the expert in the company. But that needs to be spotted as well and developed.
I think it's very pragmatic. I mean, because we have two jobs as practitioners. One, we need to identify those rough diamonds, who has the raw general potential, as you said, to succeed in those more complex future roles. However, those diamonds may not reach their potential if we don't put them on the right path. So that's that specific concept you talked about.
Yeah.
If you take someone who really doesn't want to be a leader, but perhaps a very good technical expert, they are a high potential. But if we try to force them into a leadership role, they may fail, they may be miserable, they may make the people working for them miserable. So we have to identify them based on that raw general potential. Are they a rough diamond? As you said, polish those rough diamonds based on putting them in the right part of the organization, developing them appropriately, and setting them on the right path. So step one, step two, I think it's we can simplify it that way, as you said, not overcomplicating the topic.
And there's quite some alignment in research on how to measure that general potential, actually. So we as Cubiks, we have defined a 4-quadrant potential model based on that research, but also based on our work with clients every day. And maybe can we show that in model?
This concept of general potential, we keep talking about it, the rough diamond and these raw characteristics, but what are they?
Yeah, exactly. So everyone should see a 4-quadrant model now. And the first quadrant is really about bridging to build network connections. So how does somebody go along with communicating in the organization, with building their own network and being successful in that? And then the other one is around grasping. So grasping complex tasks, also the need to understand concepts, maybe to improve concepts if they spot mistakes. And then flexibility, so the flexibility to adapt to change and to continuously learn. You can see it in every potential model in the markets. It's so important. And then finally, if you have all of that, that doesn't help if you don't want to grow. So the reaching complex, difficult goals and working on your own growth is another very important one.
And I think that we're building some nice layers here.
Yeah.
We're building those foundational layers. If you don't have a strong foundation, the building will crumble.
Yeah.
So the foundation, as you said, of bridging those relationships, having those people-oriented characteristics in order to work with others, build teams, grasping the concepts, creating the strategy, solving the problems, very much the solid foundation upon which we build someone's specific potential in this general potential concept. And I think it's a great point. If you can't adapt to change over time, if you don't want to aspire, reach, and engage in those higher level roles, then all the bridging skills and relationship building capability or mental horsepower to grasp and understand complex topics, you're not going to be able to get there.
Yeah.
So I think that simplifies it nicely and makes a lot of sense to build that foundation for the future growth of specific potential.
Yeah. And we see people being successful in organizations that display those behavioral characteristics, and they move from different roles to other roles, and they are very quick in adapting in those roles and being successful.
And that's the key. These 4 quadrants have to be very much portable and adaptable across different roles and organizations. And that's why we're calling it general potential.
Exactly.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
How do we measure these things? So we've identified, as you said, the research. There's a lot of good consensus and agreement on what the characteristics are. But if we're not looking at performance independently, how do we identify these general potential characteristics?
Well, without going too deep into the topic, because I think that would be for the next talent talk.
Yes.
There's many assessments where you can actually measure those 4 areas of potential. It goes into personality, motivation, but also ability. So cognitive ability.
And in terms of efficiency, what are your thoughts in terms of how to deploy some of those tools and some of those measures?
Well, the first measurements can actually be done online to get a first result and a first insight into where the person sees himself or herself. And then you can be as specific as you need it. So, for example, specific assessments to look at leadership. How does a person communicate with their employees? How does he build his strategies, etc.?
Well, I think that it circles back nicely to the first part of the topic you discussed in terms of reaching out more broadly, being more inclusive. That online first step of the program can cast a much wider net and get to more people and identify some of those rough diamonds. And then we can identify individuals and go into more of those more intimate, engaging steps of the process.
Yeah, sure.
Well, very good. Thank you, Anja, for your insights. It's a fun chat. Want to switch over to getting more insight from our audience at this point. So you've heard our thoughts on the topic. Hopefully you found those interesting and helpful. And you've been submitting your questions throughout. So we wanted to make sure that we made time to get your thoughts on the topic, your major areas of interest, and ensure that we're talking about those too. So, oh wow, so we have several questions coming in here. First question, Anja, what's the best time to assess potential in your employees?
Mm-hmm. So the question around which population to assess it with as well, I guess. Well, as said, it's best to spot your high potentials as early as you can. So ideally when recruiting people, and we see a lot of companies doing that, especially when they recruit graduates where there's not much other evidence of work. That's a very successful approach. And then the next main point in time we see is before people are selected into a high potential pool. So really help managers with extra evidence to make a good selection, and maybe to help with blind spots or the biases that we were addressing before.
And I think that timing really aligns to the concepts of general and specific potential, measuring the general potential early so you can get people on the right specific path to realize that potential.
Yeah.
Another really interesting question that just came in actually was around when is a hypo no longer a hypo? We've talked about the characteristics that predict individuals with general potential, putting them on that specific path to their unique version of being a high potential. But when is a hypo no longer a hypo from your perspective?
Well, most of the characteristics that we just introduced remain quite stable throughout your life. So we'll be talking about cognitive abilities, but also the attributes and drivers in your personality and motivation. Of course, your motivation can change. Of course, at some point you can be at a point where you don't want to grow anymore, where you're happy in your role. So the ambition is not there anymore, for example. So there are ways of influencing your personal drivers as well.
And I think you talked about the investment also that goes into hypos, and making sure it's the right investment in the right person. And we may identify someone with general potential, right? And if they're not taking advantage of the investment and resources that the company's putting into them, they may still have those raw abilities, but they're no longer a hypo because they're not taking advantage of the development opportunities. And perhaps there's a long line of people waiting behind them who would love to have that opportunity.
Yeah, and that can relate to both either the flex area that we discussed before, so somebody who cannot accept the feedback and steer change as well, their personal change as well. And on the other hand, maybe, the aspiration, motivation, the reach part of things.
Exactly.
Where you just stop wanting it at some point. Yeah.
A lot of good questions coming in from the group here.
Nice.
So we talked a little bit about personality, motivational, ability tools that can very easily, in an online manner, assess general potential. What about assessing high potential in an interview? It's one of the questions that came in. What are your thoughts?
Well, there are actually very good best practices on how to do that, to put somebody or to ask about previous experiences, previous tasks they needed to solve and how they went about it. So yes, there are ways of assessing that in a very good way. And of course, it's always good to combine methods when assessing for potentials, like we said before. So the interview would, to me, be the next logical step with someone.
I think aligning to the 4 quadrants with the interview, as you said, just as we're doing it through maybe an online assessment and putting those pieces together, seeing where you have overlap, where are you concerned, where do you feel that they're strong. I think that's a best practice approach. I agree. I love these. So first, general potential is important, and later specific potential. How do we measure specific potential?
Well, that really depends on what you're looking at. Like the easy example, when you're looking at leadership, I would want to see somebody also act with somebody like an employee. You can put on a role play, for example. You can also do an interview that is specifically focused on leadership skills and experiences and attitudes.
And I think once we get into specific potential, it's very specific to the organization. The person has the general potential, the raw capabilities, the rough diamond to be successful, but have they had the right job rotations? Have they had the right experiences in order to ascend into different roles?
And put on the right path. So how often do we experience employees in a leadership development centers that in the end say, well, honestly, I'm not really motivated by leading other people.
I don't see myself as a leader.
Yeah, I want to be the expert. And then this is the point where you need to change the path for that person. latest.
I think and a fit with the organization is key as well. They may be very talented, but if their values don't align with the values of the organization,
Yeah.
and they're unlikely to be retained,
Absolutely.
that specific path may not be for them, and that
Yeah.
investment may not be wise for the organization.
Yeah, or environmental factors
Absolutely.
that come in play.
In what ways can we accelerate the development of high potentials? It's an interesting question. We've talked about a better, more efficient, more objective approach to kind of scientifically identify those with general potential.
Yeah.
But in what ways? I'm sure the concern is coming from the war for talent. A lot of retirements coming up. How do we get people ready earlier than they've had to be ready to lead in the past?
Well, the first step is to spot them.
Yeah.
So, because without knowing who your potentials really are, you cannot develop them. And then have a good program in place that engages people, that is also giving them a sense of self-development, so that they are responsible for their own development, would be one.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Starting the entire process earlier by identifying them earlier is the only way to get ahead of this problem, which keeps becoming more challenging.
Yeah, sure.
Well, let's take one more question. Somebody to choose from.
Shall I point on one?
Yes, that's what you think.
Oh, I like that. How to make sure your selection process is objective.
Oh, yes.
So because that's pretty much also in line with what we hear in the market around being inclusive, being fair, being objective. And what we see currently with just the manager selecting high potentials, for example, it is prone to biases, of course.
Yeah.
So anything you can do to make your assessment more objective, by, for example, using online tools or using different assessment methods, or also training your managers in the right way to spot potential and not leave them alone with it. That all can help to have a more inclusive assessment and inclusive leadership team on the long run.
Yeah, I think the more science, the more objectivity we can insert into the process, more likely we are to be inclusive, not to fall prey to these biases, and really ultimately create a more consistent and fair program. But at the same time, I think it's a balance. Right now, it's in most organizations, it's all too subjective, and we're not proposing to automate it, right, or make it purely a technology or science-driven decision, but to really have a good mix of the two. Yeah. The good instincts of the manager, measurement of performance, but injecting that objective science, accurately predicting these 4 quadrants that we know so well from research do predict potential. Yeah. Introducing that concept and having that balance, I think, is key.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, good. Well, we have several more questions, but very little time. So thank you all for your interest and submitting those questions. Sorry we can't get to all of them.
But you can reach out to us afterwards.
Absolutely.
We're happy to try and answer all of those questions.
We'll be following up. Want to end us with some takeaways. We've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully people have found it valuable. But Anja, from your perspective, what are the 3 key learnings or 3 key takeaways you'd like our attendees to remember walking away from this conversation?
Well, 1, do something. Start now, because it's really crucial for your business success. And if you do so, don't make it too complex, because there's a lot of good research out there. There's a lot of people who have given great input on how to assess for potential. And also be clear on your common language, create that common language, because we know it's not just about performance. It's more about what we say, that potential is the future performance. Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Anja. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. We'll be reaching out to you within the next few days with the recording of our conversation. And we'll be keeping in touch for future talent talks on other topics, letting you know what those are, when they are, and we certainly hope you'll tune in with us again. Thank you so much, and best of luck in the future, identifying your high potentials and finding your rough diamonds. Thank you. Anja?
Thanks, Adam.